award at the local festival and won second prize at the Maritime Fiddle Festival. 10-year-old Carmen received the Acadia University Rose Bowl for piano at the Annapolis Valley Music Festival, and little 7-year-old Colette has been gifted with perfect pitch. On behalf of the House of Assembly, I would like to congratulate these young ladies and their parents, Acadia University statistics professor Jian Peng and their mom Gwen, who have nurtured their children's love of classical music from the womb. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, everybody, for all those very thoughtful member statements. We'll get ourselves in the mindset for QP coming up in a few seconds. And we'll wish the honourable member for Pictou West happy birthday today. We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The honourable leader of the official opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Premier. At midnight tonight, Mr. Speaker, after more than 40 years of service to the people of Pictou, the after-hours outpatient clinic at Sutherland Harris is going to close. That means, Mr. Speaker, that hundreds of residents of the area will go without the medical attention that they need. I'd like to ask the Premier, is he prepared to watch this clinic close tonight?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. I want to assure him that the Minister, the Department, the Health Authority are working around the clock, Mr. Speaker, to deal not only with that clinic, but ensuring that healthcare teams across the province are there to respond to the needs of citizens. We're very grateful for the men and women who, the doctors, the nurse practitioners, the healthcare providers who are out there working across our communities. Can we always have more? Of course we can, Mr. Speaker, and the Department and the Health Authority are working diligently to ensure that we are out there competing for those doctors.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, that's all very well and good, Mr. Speaker, but the people of Pictou County have been waiting for months to see what the plan is to keep that clinic open so that people will get the after-hours medical care that they need. It is the job of the government to make sure that they have plans in place so that these clinics don't close. Mr. Speaker, it's closing because of doctor retirements that have been known for months and months, and yet there is no plan to keep the clinic open. Mr. Speaker, why did the government fail to plan for those retirements so that clinic would not have to close tonight?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're continuing to work with our medical providers across this province to ensure that we have access to medical services in communities from one end of Nova Scotia to the other. We're working with Dow Medical School, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that we have designated seats where doctors will work in underserviced areas around Nova Scotia. We're continuing to look at a collaborative care model, Mr. Speaker. What the honourable member speaks of is not unique to Nova Scotia. It's something that's across Canada where doctors are retiring and a new healthcare delivery model is coming out where it's a collaborative practice where nurse practitioners, dietitians, Mr. Speaker, physiotherapists are working in collaboration with their team pharmacists to ensure that they provide healthcare services to their citizens. And I want to assure the honourable member that the Department, that the Health Authority will continue to work with the community of Pictou to deal with this issue.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, that clinic is going to close at midnight tonight. The people of Pictou are going to go without the after-hours care they need tonight. Mr. Speaker, they will not have the medical services that they need as of midnight tonight. There is a solution, Mr. Speaker, to make sure that they don't go interrupted in their medical needs, and that is to send some doctors there on a locum basis until a permanent solution is found, Mr. Speaker. It's sad we got to this point, but there is a way to tell the people of Pictou now that they won't go without after-hours care. Will the Premier commit to providing local doctors to keep that clinic open until a long-term solution is found?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, no citizen's province will go without medical care when required. We have a wonderful EHS service, Mr. Speaker, that's providing services across the province. We have, Mr. Speaker, we have emergency rooms across the area if they require service. Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue to work with community members to ensure that we have the healthcare team in communities across this province. I want to thank the citizens of Pictou who've been working with the Health Department and the Health Authority to continue to bring together a collaborative model that will work for the citizens in that area, just like citizens across all parts of this province, Mr. Speaker, who are working with the healthcare provider to ensure that the services there when citizens need them.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday I asked the Premier why it was that he decided not to spend $6 million he budgeted for affordable housing last year. He gave a high-level response that did not tell us why this money was not spent. So my question, Mr. Speaker, what justification can the Premier provide today to explain why he did not spend $6 million last year on affordable housing?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to thank her for giving me an opportunity to respond to it again today. Mr. Speaker, she would well know that that money would be committed. It's been carried over into this fiscal year. The issue becomes whether or not someone who's received a grant has been able to find a contractor to be able to do that work in time. We certainly wouldn't pay for services if it hadn't been completed, but we budgeted for it and set that money aside. We've seen some projects and houses that are not completed, so that money will be there set aside again as well, Mr. Speaker. That will be accounted for in this fiscal year. All of the money that has been associated for those programs is out there. We're just waiting for the work to be completed. I think the honourable member would think it would be prudent for government to wait for the completion of that work before we actually pay the bill.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you for the confirmation that the money wasn't spent, Mr. Premier. The Bloomfield Development Project is at the centre of the housing strategy. For years, the Premier has dragged his feet on the Bloomfield project, refusing to push the purchase and sale agreement past Cabinet approval. This year, the Premier decided to hit the reset button. Last month, the Premier informed the public he would be putting out an expression of interest to the private sector, meaning years of wasted time on affordable housing. Mr. Speaker, why, after 2.5 years, has the Premier just decided to put out an expression of interest to the private sector to develop the Bloomfield project?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to correct the honourable member. That money has been committed to the citizens across this province around affordable housing. We've continued to budget in this cycle, Mr. Speaker. I think it would be inappropriate for the honourable member to mislead this House to suggest that we underspent that budget when that budget is committed to those families across this province. And I believe, quite frankly, she owes an apology to the small business owners who are working with those families to complete their projects, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that we have affordable, safe housing across this province. And this government will continue to look after those citizens who require our support.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, the Bloomfield project was supposed to have been well underway by now. Imagine Bloomfield has formally cut ties with the Premier due to their frustration with the lack of progress and lack of transparency. Meanwhile, our provinces most vulnerable are losing hope that they will soon find safe and affordable housing in Bloomfield. My question for the Premier is very simple. Will the Premier commit to Nova Scotians today that the Bloomfield development construction will begin this year?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to assure all Nova Scotians that we'll continue to work with them to ensure that there's affordable housing from one end of this province to the other. We'll work with our partners to make that happen, Mr. Speaker. It's really ironic that the New Democratic Party is now here asking questions about affordable housing when for 4 years they sat on $50 million funding from the federal government and didn't invest in Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, they were waiting. Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. The Honourable Premier has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, while they left the federal money sitting in the bank, we're spending it with Nova Scotians and ensuring that our contractors deliver affordable housing in Nova Scotia.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Health. A Pictou County doctor recently closed down his practice, and he told his patients if they couldn't find a doctor, in fact they probably wouldn't find a doctor, that they should rely on the Sutherland Harris after-hours outpatient clinic. After today, we all know that that clinic is no longer there, and Mr. Speaker, I am deeply concerned for these constituents. Will the Minister please advise the residents of Pictou, who now have no doctor, no after-hours outpatient clinic, where are they to seek medical help?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What I can tell the member opposite is that so far in 2016, recruitment is going very well across the province. We've been able to fill positions in communities that.
The Honourable Minister of Health has the floor.
We've been able to recruit in some communities that have gone looking for a doctor over a 5-6 year period. And yesterday I named some of those communities, Bedeck and Neils Harbor, as examples. And now we're going to take a look at what is needed in Pictou. I know there's a collaborative practice where a number of these patients will move towards as this private practice now closes.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Mr. Speaker, the whole county is gobsmacked by this news. This is not HRM. This is rural Nova Scotia. We don't have public transit. There's 1,000 Nova Scotians a month turning 65. We need doctors. I want to know if the minister can stand in his place and admit that under his watch that the clinic in Pictou was closed under his watch, and what he is going to do to ensure that it's going to open within the next week.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What I can say to the member opposite is that overall we are doing very, very well as we look across the country. Are there pockets? Are there moments when a doctor gets sick, decides on a short notice that they are retiring? We have those situations. What I'm pleased to tell the member as well in the general context is that the 2016 data from the Canadian Mental Health Association has Nova Scotia with the third most family doctors per 100,000 population in the country, and I can guarantee to the member that Dr. Lowe and the Health Authority are looking at the needs of Pictou as we speak.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister responsible for NSBI. The EastLink Fund was created to support local television productions and is the only Nova Scotia-based equity fund remaining for local producers. Last fall, NSBI received conditional approval from the CRTC to transition this fund from the now defunct agency Film and Creative Industries Nova Scotia to NSBI. However, the Minister has stated no applications will be received for the fund till May 30th. So my question for the Minister is, why is it taking 7 months for NSBI to actualize this pre-existing fund?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank my colleague for the question. As I've indicated through budget estimates and discussions that I had with my colleague last evening, the EastLink Fund requires certification. NSBI has been engaged with CRTC for an extended period of time now, working towards that certification. And as I indicated last night, we anticipate that process will be completed this May.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Professional productions are tied to timelines, dependent on the availability of cast, crews, directors, locations, and local productions such as Studio Black are concerned that delays in accessing the EastLink Fund will jeopardize their future. Studio Black is nominated for several awards and provides 50 jobs, many of which are to African Nova Scotians who traditionally have not had access to this important industry. So my question for the Minister is, what exactly is he doing to try to ensure that local productions, such as Studio Black, are not jeopardized by these NSBI's timelines?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I first want to recognize the work that Studio Black has done in the past and the opportunities that they do present to African Nova Scotians. I've indicated and shared with my colleague through budget estimates that the EastLink Fund is application-based, and for anyone to conclude that funding is available and approved is not the approach that we would want to see producers take. That fund, we believe, will be active with certification in May. It's an application-based funding model, and we look forward to applications from Studio Black as well as other producers that may be able to access that fund.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Business. Yesterday, under question in this House, we learned from the Minister of Business that, in fact, a $100,000 Deloitte study on the credit union small business financing program had been done only last year. That contradicted his answer to the same question the day before, where he said no such study had been done in the 13-year history of the program. Mr. Speaker, I imagine that perhaps the minister wasn't aware that the study had been done at the time he gave us that answer, but if it was news to him, it should really be news and available to all of us. I'd like to ask him if he will table the Deloitte study into that program by the end of question period today.
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I explained to the Leader of the Opposition in previous question period, the study that was done previous was around the administration of the program. The study going forward will be around the finances of the program. He's the accountant. He should know the difference.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the only difference that remains unexplained is why he told us there was no study one day, and then only under questioning did he admit there had in fact been a study just last year, 24 hours later. I've asked him if he'll table it. I hope he will, so we can all see the benefits of that program, Mr. Speaker, because it's the only tool available to help small business in Nova Scotia today. It's been proven to be very successful. I suspect the Deloitte study will confirm what a successful program it is. He shouldn't be afraid to table it for that very reason, Mr. Speaker. Now we have a second study on the same program. While this is going on, credit unions across the province are wondering whether they can continue to process applications to help small businesses create jobs or not. So will the minister table that study in this House today, yes or no?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It just amazes me that the Leader of the Opposition continues to fearmonger with the small business community of this province. Mr. Speaker, I want to assure the Leader of the Opposition and all small businesses in Nova Scotia, including the credit unions who administer the program, that the program continues and that credit unions continue to take applications. We will do an analysis on the fund to ensure that we're able to sustain that fund going forward for the benefit of small businesses in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Auditor General's report last week highlighted how government departments measuring up on implementing his recommendations. Within the Department of Health, only 20% of the Auditor General's recommendations regarding personal health information systems were implemented for the IWK Health Centre. For the Nova Scotia Health Authority, only 24% were implemented during that same time. His report clearly states that we believe more progress could have been made to complete these recommendations. My question to the Minister of Health, will he explain why he failed to ensure that these important recommendations were implemented?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And what I can say, first of all, in terms of recommendations, at 75%, the Department of Health is at the highest compliance level in the history of recommendations coming from the Auditor General. This particular area that the member rightly asked a question about is in fact, we know that we're looking now and advancing this year through the budget. I think we've seen the number, the millions of dollars that will go into our one patient, one record this year, and that will certainly move this file much quicker than we have in the past.
The Honourable Member for Argyle-Barrington.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the highest percentage of any department, of course, is CCH, who had 100% of its recommendations done. The Speaker's office has 100% of its recommendations done. 78 by far, sir, is not the highest one in the province. We've already seen the consequences of the minister's failure to ensure the Auditor's General's recommendations were implemented. Just 3 weeks ago, we learned that a business owner had to go to the media because she was fed up receiving faxes of personal health records at her business for the past 10 years. Only one only needs to go to the Supreme Court of Nova Scotia website to see 2 class action suits started in 2012 that deal with the breach of privacy of patient records. So my question to the minister, when will the minister stand up for patients in Nova Scotia and get his department in order by implementing all of the Auditor General recommendations.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. If I do need to make a correction there, it's the highest level, obviously, in the Health Department that we have seen the Auditor General's recommendations. And I do also need to remind both ministers opposite that calls came under their watch. And when I first heard of this issue, we immediately set the Privacy Commissioner in place to get the job done.
The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne. Order, please. The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. A number of hours that the ER have been closed certainly has risen dramatically under this government. Last year, there was over 11,000 hours of ER closure times in Cape Breton alone. Now, with the most recent budget, we learned that the funding for ER departments have been cut. Mr. Speaker, my question for the Minister is, given that the rise of ER closure times, why has the ER department or the emergency funding have been cut in this year's budget?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I think what the member may not be aware of is that many of these ERs continue to have that designation under the Department of Health, but in reality now they have daytime hours. Even some of the collaborative emergency centres also have designated hours. They do remain under that general area of emergency rooms, and we know that that's part of the reason for many of the hours.
The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne.
Mr. Speaker, as the MLA for Queens Shelburne, I know I have placed the focus on ER closures at Roseway, but this is not an isolated problem. ER closures have affected Nova Scotians across our beautiful province, and I don't think anyone in this chamber wants to see a life lost because of a lack of access to an ER. Mr. Speaker, I ask the Minister, with rampant ER closures and less funding in the budget, what is his plan to decrease, I repeat, to decrease the number of ER closures this year?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What I know now is that many of the ERs, and I have visited the vast majority of our community hospitals across Nova Scotia, and what used to be a full-fledged human resource ER are now outpatient clinics. And in fact, when there is a trauma, when there is an accident, in fact, it's EHS that we need to be calling. We have the best paramedic service in the country.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question's for the Minister of Justice. The Minister of Justice recently announced a consultation on maintenance enforcement, which is fine, but I'm sure that she understands that there are serious issues existing today. For some time, my office has been dealing with a case of a woman whose former partner is living in the city but hasn't paid support in years. Now, maintenance enforcement recently wrote this woman to ask if the case could be dropped. Mr. Speaker, I won't name the individual publicly here because she's asked that the investigation continues, but I will provide the Minister the name afterwards. Does the Minister think the maintenance enforcement policy of sending letters to people asking if their case can be closed, even with no evidence of payment, is appropriate?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And as the member opposite knows, I wouldn't be able to speak to an individual case either, but I welcome the opportunity to speak about our efforts in maintenance enforcement. And actually, in the last year, we've had really a no-tolerance policy. We're not varying court orders. We're going after anybody that has a court order, whether they tell us a story that's sad or not. You have to go to court to get your court order changed, and we're really not showing any leniency at all. So I would have to look into this case to see what's going on.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm glad the minister mentioned no leniency in investigating, because my office spoke to maintenance enforcement and they told us that the only thing they do to search for people is to search income tax and HST records for delinquent individuals. And in this case, there were no records for this person, so they said they couldn't find him. We worked with the woman and in 2 hours not only found him on Facebook, but found his common-law spouse working for the province in the city, in Halifax, in 2 hours working with the woman. In fact, it was also determined that the individual not paying child support had just returned from a Caribbean vacation. And all this information was provided to maintenance enforcement over a month and a half ago, and they still said they just searched tax records. So, Mr. Speaker, I know she can't speak to individual cases, but what is her expectation of how deeply MEP staff should go to try and find deadbeat parents?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And again, I find the information a little bit, it's certainly disturbing, because the information I have is we're using our investigators in the Department of Justice. I think the authority for the enforcement officers, who are all in New Waterford, as you know, that's a good place to be. You're right. One person is excited, but their authority, Mr. Speaker, is limited by the Act. But we have given instructions that the people that they can't find, that become sort of stale files, if you like, they're off to one side, that they refer those on a regular basis to our investigators in the Department of Justice. And I was told in just one recent month, 50 cases were referred to the investigators. They will certainly check all the internet files and really leave no stone unturned to find them, and they're finding a good number of the ones that maintenance enforcement staff couldn't. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Environment. The last Environmental Goals and Prosperity Act Progress Report was released in December 2014. At that time, only 12 out of the 25 goals had been achieved. There were still 13 goals in some form of progress yet to be complete. What financial investments were made in this budget to ensure that the other goals will be fulfilled in the coming fiscal year?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member may be aware, the new EXPO report will be released very soon. We'll have a lot of measures that will be announced at that time, and we'll be moving forward and making the House aware of all the measures that are taking place.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for her answer. When the last report was tabled, it covered only activity up until March 31st, 2014. That was 2 years ago, over 2 years ago, actually. We would like to know that the Minister's Department has been actively working on this, and actually on page 4 from the Minister's report here, it states that they work closely with other departments within the government. Can she please stand in her place and let me know what departments she has actually worked with in the last number of months?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Yeah, as I said previously to the Honourable Member, we have been working closely. My department's been working closely with many departments. We're working on climate change initiatives, all different things, GHG levels to be reduced, and we're making a lot of progress with that. We're actually going to meet or exceed our 2020 limits. One of the first provinces. Actually, we are the only province to be able to do that. We're also working extensively with protected lands with the Minister of Natural Resources. We have now 12.26% of our province is now protected. We'll be aiming towards 13%. We'll help to make that announcement soon. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River, Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of TIR. Last year I asked the Minister about his department's plan to address the terrible condition of the Gillis Pike Road in Washabuck. At the time, it had been just voted CAA's worst road in Atlantic Canada for the second straight year. Right now, it is leading the vote for the worst road in Nova Scotia again, and I'll table that. This year, it's not in the 5-year plan, but last year the Minister said the department would look at chip seal and rehabilitation, and I'll table that as well. So my question is, would the Minister please tell us what action his department has taken to improve the road conditions that continues to attract negative publicity for rural roads in Victoria County?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do thank the member opposite for the question. With respect to the Gillis Point Road, and the roads that lead in, which is St. Columbo Road from Iona. We've paved 3.5 kilometres of that St. Columbo Road, which gives access to Gillis Point Road. We've identified some of the worst sections of Gillis Point Road this year for reconstruction of the roadbed, which certainly will be several $100,000 to complete. And now we're doing an assessment on the full-scale chip seal operation to see if that's acceptable. So we'll get some estimates on that, and of course we'll consult with the community. And just so that the member knows and the House knows, the member from Victoria the Lakes has been a champion for this road. She hears about it every day, as do many of us. So we appreciate that work. We know it's on our radar screen. The reality is it's a low-volume road, but there is some tough conditions there. I've been there, and we'll continue to do what we can to invest in it and strengthen that road.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the Minister for his answer. We know roads in the area are travelled not only by residents but tourists who are looking at the views of the beautiful Bedore Lakes. It's a very important area for transportation with the nearby Highland Village, as well as the annual Gaelic Festival, which is held in Christmas Island. Recently, a visitor to the Iona Heights Inn recounted the terrible state of the roads around Washapuck, and I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. Will the Minister commit to specifically improving the roads in Washapuck this year so the local residents can be proud of the state of the roads and no longer find their roads on CAA's worst in Atlantic Canada?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and again, thank the member opposite. Look, there's certainly some tough conditions on the entire roadway, including when you leave the 223 from Iona, there's about 16 kilometres, and certainly there are some rough spots. The tough reality is, and I've had many candid conversations through the member from Victoria the Lakes with Vince McLean and other advocates for that road, it's extremely low volume, and that's the reality that many members face across this province with respect to repaving, restructuring, gravel roads, of course. So we have to do what we can with our budgets and with our allocations, but we have made that commitment to continue to do work there. We haven't stopped. We haven't been idle again. Repaving the entrance was a big start. Now we're looking at upgrading those specific parts of the road bed that have failed, and we're going to look at that long-term solution. If the community supports chip seal, then we'll certainly look at that for the long term.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many Nova Scotians are concerned about the state of our health care under this government, Mr. Speaker. These concerns have only grown since the budget was tabled last week. When you factor in inflation, the health budget has seen a cut for the second year in a row, Mr. Speaker. I asked the Minister of Health, how will cuts to health care funding improve health services in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I want to inform the House and all Nova Scotians that part, of course, of the reduction in the budget is that we have moved some monies over to the Health Authority, but perhaps more significantly is the amount that has gone to communities, culture and heritage. And what we're finding out, and many experts told us, is it's not about more money, it's about doing business differently in this province.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, the Health Authority comes under the Minister's responsibility and his budget, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, there was a lot of discussion about the government's promise to ensure every Nova Scotian has a doctor, and the reality of the current doctor shortage across this province. Given this doctor shortage, it is difficult to understand why the budget for physician services has been cut by $500,000, Mr. Speaker. The budget for alternative payments plans is down. Emergency department funding is down, and the list goes on and on, Mr. Speaker. I asked the Minister, how will this budget improve the doctor shortages seen across communities in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to say that we're actually the third in Canada in terms of residents with a regular family doctor. Our goal is to move up another notch in this province, and I know that our tuition relief program is working. We're now finally getting a provincial approach to recruitment and retention, as opposed to the 9 fragmented and people competing for the same doctor. We will have a much better and more robust work in our province.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Environment. Mr. Speaker, for several years the government has floated the idea of implementing extended producer responsibility in Nova Scotia, and last November the then Minister of the Environment suggested that it was still being worked on, but there's been no update. Businesses have warned that implementing the program would have significant costs on small businesses in Nova Scotia. My question, Mr. Speaker, for the Minister is, can the Minister provide an update on whether or not the government is continuing to consider extended producer responsibility?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member opposite for that question. It's funny I'm getting questions today that I'm not expecting, and it's interesting. EPR is something that we've been talking about at many levels, whether it's been municipal or provincial. We want to look at EPR programs. We want to make sure that we have the best program for businesses in Nova Scotia, that we can move forward, do it responsibly, and yet recognize what small business, what handicaps it will also have to small business in the area. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the Minister for that answer. The Canadian Federation of Independent Business has said it would be a mistake to implement EPR in Nova Scotia. When we are all trying to encourage small business to grow, this will do the opposite. Businesses and farmers are worried about the increased cost of doing this business. My question for the Minister is, can the Minister of Environment confirm that small businesses in Nova Scotia will not be faced with increased costs of business due to her policies?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank the member again for that question. It's very important, and I know it's really important to small business. As a former farmer myself, I realize that this can certainly have an impact on small business in the community, and also all business, whether it be farm-related or otherwise. But as we continue discussions, there are some stakes in the ground for us on this matter. EPR has to have a strong business case in Nova Scotia, and it must improve the environmental footprint and performance, not just shift the costs. So if EPR does move ahead, it will be a full EPR model for the paper and packaging.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Natural Resources. According to the Off-Highway Vehicle 2015 survey, which I'll table in a few seconds, there are over 40,000 riders in the province, and their direct spending is estimated to be $189.4 million. Advance has been working with government to try to resolve a few issues, including trailhead connectivity, access to services like gas stations, and supporting the next generation of riders. Safety and enforcement are vital, but so is sustainability. My question to the Minister, what is the Minister doing to modernize the regulations to promote safe ridership and encourage longevity? Having a little problem with that word, Mr. Speaker. Longevity of this valuable Nova Scotia sport, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member opposite for the excellent question. The Department of Natural Resources, for its involvement with this important sector, has a great relationship with ATVANS and SANS across the province, and we have been working with them steadily. There is a lot of interdepartmental work going on. Many of the keys, as is often in government, to advancing some changes and modernizing some of these activities lie with other departments, and we have a great relationship with DOTIR, and a committee has been struck to look at that. So we value the partnership. We know that there's an opportunity there. We know that it has an economic impact, and we continue to work to realize that opportunity. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East. Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Longevity, Mr. Speaker, there's a couple of comments behind me, and I'm not sure I agree with them, but anyway. Mr. Speaker, the ATV Association is a sport and a hobby for many Nova Scotians, but they also spend money and time to build and maintain trails. They provide valuable support for search and rescue, and they spend a lot of money in our rural communities on things like gas and equipment. They have met with TIR and DNR, but talks seem to have stalled. My question to the Minister, has the Minister ruled out making these changes to the Off-Highway Vehicle Act and regulations?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member for the question. One important section that has been left out of his description of how this works, talked about hobby and recreation, but in Nova Scotia, our farmers, our fishermen, lots of people use these vehicles as work vehicles. They're like tractors were some time ago. So when I talk to ATVANS I point that out to them, that not only is it a recreational thing, which may appear to be frivolous expenditure, but it's an important work expenditure for the people of Nova Scotia. We support this industry through the OHV fund, which is working very, very smoothly, I must say, and have delegated responsibility for that down to the various groups. And I commend those groups for the excellent job they do in organizing this in Nova Scotia.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government has defended its cut of the film tax credit by touting the new Film and Television Production Incentive Fund. This fund, we've been told, has $10 million available for filmmakers. Well, thanks to questions we've raised in the budget session, it's becoming clear that productions approved last year will actually draw on the current year's budget, which would mean that the $10 million incentive fund is actually being spread out over 2 years. Will the minister please confirm that the funds available for new productions in the current year's incentive fund are in fact less than $7 million?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. Again, I've laid out that funding model within budget estimates. There's $3.3 million drawn down on that fund now, with 16 productions that have been applications that have been approved. There's 6.7 that remains in that fund for producers to continue to access. And as I explained in budget estimates, there will be productions applications this year that are approved that will not be paid out until the next fiscal year. So the member is very much aware of the process and how that fund will work going forward.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
So it sounds to me, Mr. Speaker, like there is only $6.7 million available now, since the first $3.3 million was for productions that were done last year. So it appears there are still problems with the application process. It's a slow process, Mr. Speaker, bound up in red tape. Approval with actual dollar amounts is not finalized until the production is complete, making it almost impossible for producers to secure the loans and funds from other sources that they need. So let's not forget, this industry generated $180 million for their GDP and 3,200 jobs in 2014. My question for the minister, will the government increase the budget for this year's incentive fund when the $7 million approximately currently available is spent?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do want to clarify. The member has suggested that the process is not what it should be, and I want to table an article, Mr. Speaker, from Screen Nova Scotia, and a speech that Mark Allman made in Ontario. And he says, specific to the Nova Scotia New Production Incentive Fund, offers up to 32% all spend rates. Thanks to our friends at Nova Scotia Business Inc., the administrator of the program, the rebate offers an exceptionally fast payout of funds that lowers interim financing costs. Pretty clear the administration of the fund is working, Mr.
Speaker. The honourable member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Business. I'll repeat that, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Business. Mr. Speaker, the historic Apple Blossom Festival in the Valley is now in its 84th year. Each spring, the beautiful apple blossoms, which appear in late May, form the focus of this celebration. Each year, we have 100,000 people, both local from across the country and around the world, attend. Being one of the first events of the summer tourism season since the blossoms are early, the Apple Blossom Festival needs the support of Tourism Nova Scotia. My question for the Minister is this. Can the Minister tell this House how the late start of the tourism advertising campaign this spring will specifically help the Apple Blossom Festival this year?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And with the movement of events to community culture and heritage, I'll ask my colleague to respond.
The Honourable Minister of Community Culture and Heritage.
Thank you for that. As we have all the events coming to the province, any organization that is interested in looking at these events and trying to get those events supported, contact my office. We'll be happy to work with you. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure who I should direct this question to, but I'll direct it to the Minister of Business, and he can redirect it if he wants. Mr. Speaker, these events happen because of very dedicated and very committed volunteers such as President Gary Long, Vice President Lindsay Young, and Treasurer David Cunningham, and a host of other volunteers. Recently, the organizers of the Apple Blossom Festival Committee saw the need to start a GoFundMe campaign, and I will table that on behalf of the Apple Blossom Festival. My question to the Minister is this: does the Minister believe that these important festivals should have to resort to GoFundMe campaigns? And if not, what is his department or government willing to do about that?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think it's critically important, as my colleague has identified, the local effort that fundraising groups are putting into hosting community events that are both provincial and municipal in attention. The events funding model has been transferred to Community and Culture and Heritage. The Minister has indicated anyone who has community events can inquire and apply through his department. But I think it's critically important, and we're seeing this more and more every day, Mr. Speaker. Individuals and communities are stepping up to support community events. They're partnering with the province and their municipal government. That is the right model of funding. That is the right model of service delivery, and it's the best outcome for Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Mr. Speaker, my question to you is for the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, there's no question in my mind that the Minister is an honourable person. His government and he campaigned on a doctor for every Nova Scotian. Right now, 10 doctors are short in Cape Breton Island. The orphan clinic is full. People are sitting on the floors waiting for an opportunity to talk to the doctor. Mr. Speaker, how can this minister look the people of Cape Breton in the eye and tell them that we have the third highest ratio of doctors in the country, yet thousands of Cape Bretoners have no doctors? What is the ratio of doctors in Cape Breton?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And the member opposite has asked a very, very good question, one that I will get a very exact answer for him. We know that Cape Breton, like other parts of the province, are transitioning to a greater collaborative care model. We had 3 areas, for example. One was the Premier's riding in Annapolis Royal, Bridgewater, Clare, all for a decade had trouble attracting enough doctors. Now those 3 have sufficient doctors, and I believe as we move to the collaborative model, we will have sufficient doctors for Cape Breton as well.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I do appreciate the minister's offers of getting that information, but we have doctors that are still leaving. The doctor that does infection control, by the way, Mr. Speaker, if it wasn't for that doctor, I wouldn't be here today to irritate that minister. But he is planning on leaving. He's planning on leaving. We keep hearing about this doctor ratio. We keep hearing about how there's enough doctors, and yet people keep calling our offices day after day, Mr. Speaker, looking for somebody to look after them. So the real question is, will the minister put that information on the floor of the House today? What is the ratio of doctors in Cape Breton?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As I said, I will certainly get that information for the member opposite. It is an important piece of information. I'm pleased to hear the member opposite say what great care he got from the doctors in Cape Breton. That's a signature piece that I hear as I travel across the province. I think we may have a trump card because if Trump becomes president, we're going to have an influx of doctors to Cape Breton from the U.S.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Mr. Speaker, family physicians across Nova Scotia have played an important role with recruitment of doctors. When a family practice sees a need and a demand, they often will expand their practice, Mr. Speaker. Dr. Sad is one of those physicians, and there are others, who have tried to get a license to expand their practice to meet the needs. I've written to the Minister about Dr. Sad's situation in Beaverbank. and he still was denied, Mr. Speaker, the ability to meet the demands. They're getting calls every day from patients who have no family doctor. Why has the minister allowed this to happen when family physicians want to play a role with the recruitment of family physicians? Why are they being denied the ability to meet the needs of Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I know for Dr. Sad and others in the HRM that have set up private clinics in the past, did some of their own recruitment. That model for the future is also not sustainable. My first meeting as a minister was to try to save the Lacewood Clinic, and some of these models, are just not sustainable. We will start collaborative practices here in HRM that have very few at the moment, and this is going to be a method that will be sustainable and viable for the future right across our province.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Cobequid.
That's the issue and concern. Will start. It's not happening today. So why are you denying doctors today who want to address the issue of physician shortages in this province? If you have that system up and running, I could understand. But there are people today in our province who do not have a family doctor, and they're denying licenses to doctors who want to address that. Why won't the minister allow these physicians in the HRM to recruit and do the work for the government? They're doing it for free. Why won't they change direction on this until these clinics are open and allow doctors in this province to recruit doctors who want to come here and want to work and serve Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What we know is that not just in the HRM, but right across Nova Scotia, we are committed to changing the model. We all went through the walk-in clinic piece earlier in the year. Those doctors that own or invested in the walk-in clinics have agreed to cooperate on the collaborative model, and that's what we are developing here in HRM.
Thank you very much. Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. We'll now move on to government business. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that you do now leave the chair and the House resolve itself into a committee on supply.
The House will now recess for 1 minute while we allow members to exit the chamber and populate the red room. And we resolve. And we will have a chance for a debate going into supply. I'm just going to give a minute to clear the room here.